used to think my town was peaceful, quiet, forgettable even. One of those places you pass by on the highway, not even slowing down, barely glancing at the fields stretching out on either side. You wouldn't even remember the name of it, just a blip on the map, a speck between somewhere and anywhere else. Nothing happens here. That's what I always believed. I'd tell you it's a nice place, but that feels like a lie now. There's always been something unsettling about how normal it seems. The kind of normal that makes you second guess it, like maybe it's trying a little too hard. The locals don't talk much, not about the things that matter, not about the things I've seen, but then again, no one really notices this place. Maybe that's the point. I'd been on the force for 5 years when it happened, spring of 14, if I remember right. That time of year when everything's damp and the air smells like wet earth, right before the world wakes up again. Back then, there were only 5 of us in the department. Just a handful of faces. Jerry, my partner, Pete and Vance, who worked the night shifts, the chief, and Karen, a retired librarian who handled dispatch when she felt like getting out of the house. The station itself wasn't much to look at either. 2 cramped offices and 3 jail cells we never really needed. Like I said, nothing ever happened here. But that day, something did. It was one of those overcast afternoons, the kind where the sky hangs low and heavy, threatening more rain. Jerry and I were doing our usual rounds, driving slow, talking about nothing in particular, when Karen's voice crackled through the radio. There was a tremor in her voice I hadn't heard before. Possible 10, 82 in progress, she said, her words clipped like she didn't want to say it too loud. A burglary. I almost laughed. A burglary? In this town? It didn't fit, but then she said where? The Garrity house on Turner Road. I didn't say anything, but Jerry and I exchanged a glance, both of us thinking the same thing. The Garrity house. That place hadn't seen visitors in years. We acknowledged the call and turned the cruiser toward the Garrity place. I wasn't too worried. Truth be told, I already knew who called it in. Eileen Garrity. Lived alone in that crumbling old farmhouse just outside town ever since her husband passed a few years back. She had to be pushing 70, maybe more, and her mind had started to go with the years. She'd call us out once or twice a month, always about noises, shadows she swore were creeping around her yard at night. Her kids, long gone, moved out of town ages ago. No visits, no calls, just left her out there in that house, alone. We figured this would be more of the same. Another false alarm. Since her husband passed, Eileen had earned a reputation around town. Eccentric, if you were being kind. Crazy, if you weren't. She never left her house, had groceries delivered, and called us regularly for just about anything. Noises in the attic, strange lights in her cornfield, everything was a threat in her eyes. The intruders she thought were creeping through her attic. Just raccoons. The UFOs in her field, jets from the National Guard base. Every call was a false alarm. We figured today would be no different. We never gave Eileen a hard time about her calls. In fact, we usually went along with it, checked her house, walked the property, just to ease her mind. She'd thank us, her nerves would settle, and then a few weeks later we'd be back, doing it all over again. Honestly, those trips to her place were a welcome break from the monotony. Not much else happened in this town. Jerry and I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. There she was, frail and jumpy, living alone in that decaying farmhouse with no friends, no family nearby. I figured she might be slipping, maybe the early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's. She was too isolated, almost a mile from the closest neighbor. If something happened, if her health gave out or she had a fall, well, there wasn't much we could do. The thought gnawed at me sometimes, but Eileen seemed too stubborn to ask for real help. We turned onto Turner Road, rain drumming steadily on the windshield. Same old routine, or so we thought. Just another false alarm. Eileen overreacting, her imagination running wild again. But as we pulled up to the house, something was immediately off. She was waiting for us on the porch, and I'll never forget how she looked. The sight of her sent a jolt through me. She'd always been frail, but now she was a shadow of the woman we'd seen just a couple months ago. Her skin clung to her bones, her cheeks hollowed out, eyes sunken with dark circles beneath them. Her gray hair was a tangled mess, like it hadn't seen a brush or water in days, maybe longer. The dress she wore hung off her like it hadn't been washed in weeks. But it wasn't just her appearance that rattled me, it was her eyes. Those dull, bloodshot eyes didn't just look at us, they stared through us like we weren't really there. It was the kind of stare you see in photos of soldiers, shell-shocked and broken by the horrors they'd witnessed. Whatever was going on here, it was different. Something had changed. Jerry and I exchanged a quick, startled glance before stepping out of the cruiser. The rain was heavier now, the air thick with a damp chill. We approached Mrs. Garrity cautiously, her hollow eyes following us but not really seeing. "What's the trouble, Mrs. Garrity?" Jerry asked, trying to keep it light, though there was an edge in his voice.
"There's something in my house,"
she said, her voice flat, almost lifeless. She was shaken, barely holding herself together. Something, not someone. That made me pause. I caught Jerry's eye. He raised a brow. This wasn't like her usual calls. "You just wait here," I said, keeping my tone as casual as I could manage. "We'll check it out, make sure it's safe." With a nod to Jerry, we drew our pistols and stepped past her, entering the dark, musty house. The door creaked shut behind us, and the smell hit me. Stale air, damp wood, something else. Rotten, almost. We swept the first floor, guns drawn, eyes scanning every corner. Nothing out of place. Up the stairs we went, the old boards creaking beneath us, the house eerily silent except for our footsteps. 5 minutes, tops. It was a routine we knew by heart. No intruders, no signs of a break-in. But what we did find, it was worse. The house was worse than I'd ever seen it. Mrs. Garrity had always kept it spotless, but now dirty dishes filled the sink, trash and laundry were scattered everywhere, and the counters were grimy. In the living room, her blankets and pillow were tossed on the couch, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups, food containers, a Bible, and a rosary. It was clear she'd been living there for some time. Upstairs, her bedroom was untouched, the bed bare, confirming what we already suspected. She hadn't been upstairs in a while. Everything about the place screamed neglect, and something else. Something unsettling. In the living room, something caught my eye. A double-barreled shotgun propped in the corner. It looked old, likely her late husband's. Jerry checked it out, opening the chamber to reveal 2 spent shells. He sniffed one, confirming it had been fired recently. But that wasn't all. Every mirror in the house was shattered, and all the closet doors were boarded up. The front hall closet door had a gaping hole blasted through it, with smaller splinters around the impact. It was clear Mrs. Garrity had fired the shotgun at that door, but why? The scene was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong here. Jerry glanced at me, his face twisted in confusion. I could only shrug, just as lost as he was. We holstered our pistols, figuring we'd seen enough. Time to head back out and reassure Mrs. Garrity, tell her everything was fine. But as we turned, there she was, standing in the room watching us with that eerie, vacant stare. Neither of us had heard her come in. We both jumped. Jerry recovered first, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We didn't see any sign of him, Mrs. Garrity. Must have slipped out the back. You're safe now." But she didn't react. No relief, no thanks like before. Instead, something shifted in her face. A twitch, a flicker of something darker. It took me a second to place it. Sheer, hopeless terror.
"No,
She said, her voice flat, dead.
I'm not safe. It's still here, hiding. That's why you couldn't find it. And when you leave, it'll come for me."
My blood ran cold. The way she said it, so certain, so final. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a death sentence. Then she started to shake, her frail body racked with sobs. It wasn't the kind of crying that just fades away. This was pure despair, the kind that left you hollow. Jerry and I exchanged another look, uneasy now. We guided her gently to the couch, sitting beside her as we tried to calm her down. It took a few minutes, but eventually her sobs subsided. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, trembling.
"It started about a month ago.
She said.
That's when I first heard the scratching at my closet door."
Scratching, she explained, soft and steady, always at night. At first, she thought it might be a mouse, but the sound was too high up, not where a mouse would be. Each time she checked the closet, there was nothing. Just silence. Several nights, she'd almost opened the door while the scratching continued, but something stopped her. A cold, creeping dread that gripped her the moment her hand touched the knob. The sound was too deliberate, too patient, as if whatever was behind that door wanted her to open it. So she'd started locking the closet at night, hoping that would be enough, but it only got worse. The scratching grew louder, more desperate, like something was trying to claw its way out. One day, she finally opened the door and found claw marks on the inside, 6 feet off the ground. That cold pit in my stomach returned. I glanced at the boarded-up closet, the one with the shotgun blast, and suddenly, the house felt much smaller, the air thicker. Something wasn't right here, not at all. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and I could feel the air in the room shift, growing heavier with every word.
"One night,"
she continued,
"I woke up to a voice, soft, gentle, calling me from behind the locked closet door.
I held my breath, already dreading where this was going.
It was Bill's voice. My Bill. My husband."
Jerry shifted beside me, eyes wide, his knuckles white against the couch. I felt my stomach twist. Bill had been dead for years.
"He begged me to open the door. Said God sent him down to bring me to heaven. Told me we'd be young again, together like we used to be. I thought it was a dream. It had to be. Bill's been gone for so long, you know. And in a dream, it didn't seem like there was any harm in it. So I got up and I went to the closet. I reached for the lock. But something stopped me. It was Bill's voice, but it wasn't. Not really. There was something off. The way he was talking, it wasn't how Bill used to talk. It felt like a stranger using his voice, trying to trick me."
Her voice trailed off, her words hanging in the thick air. She looked at us, confusion in her eyes.
"That doesn't make sense, does it?"
she asked, almost pleading. Nothing about her story made sense, but we didn't say that. We just nodded and urged her to go on. She said Bill, or whatever had stolen his voice, kept begging her to open the closet door. At first, the pleas had been desperate, almost pitiful. But when she refused, the voice turned sharp, demanding. It cursed at her, hurled insults, spat threats that no living version of her husband would have ever said. Then the pounding began, heavy fists smashing against the closet door as if trying to tear it down. The voice changed, she said. It deepened, became warped, no longer human. She had fled the room, spent the night downstairs on the couch, clutching her rosary. The pounding eventually stopped, but the silence was just as terrifying.
I didn't want to bother you. I thought it was all in my head. Everyone thinks I'm a crazy old woman anyway.
But it hadn't stopped. Every night the pounding returned, louder, more forceful. It wasn't just in her bedroom now. It came from every closet, the same awful voice in all of them at once, like the house itself was alive and trying to break free. I glanced around the room, feeling an unnatural stillness settle in. The boarded-up closets, the shattered mirrors, the shotgun leaning against the wall, it all seemed to hum with a terrible weight. Her voice trembled as she went on.
It was always worse at night, but at least the days were safe. I could sleep when the sun was up. But 3 days ago, it started happening all the time, day and night, no breaks, no safety.
She swallowed hard, eyes wide with panic.
This morning, the pounding got so bad I thought the doors would break. So I prayed. I read from the Bible, but that just made it laugh like it was mocking me. I couldn't take it anymore, so I grabbed Bill's shotgun and fired into the closet.
A heavy silence filled the room. Her hands were shaking again.
For a second, I thought I'd done it. It stopped. There was no sound. But then I saw them, those red eyes, staring out from the hole I made in the door, and it chuckled. Then it said one word.
I leaned in closer, feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. What word? I asked. She looked up, eyes wide, face pale as a ghost.
Tonight.
She broke down again, trembling as sobs racked her frail body. The word hung in the air like a death sentence, pressing in on all of us. Jerry and I stood there, the weight of her story hanging in the air between us. We didn't say a word for a while, just exchanged a look that said everything. We didn't believe it, of course, couldn't, but the truth of it didn't matter. What mattered was the fear in her eyes, the way she trembled. Her grip on reality was unraveling, that much was obvious. Maybe it was old age creeping in, or maybe the house was affecting her. Some unseen mold festering behind those decaying walls, warping her thoughts. We excused ourselves, stepping out into the damp, gray afternoon. The chill in the air seemed sharper after hearing her tale. Jerry leaned against the car, his face set in a grim line. "She can't stay there anymore," he muttered. I nodded, agreeing without hesitation. That place, whether it was ghosts, paranoia, or something else, was eating her alive. We didn't know what exactly, but we knew she needed to be away from it. For tonight, at least. When we walked back in, she was sitting there, staring at the floor, her hands wringing together like she was trying to hold herself together. I kept my voice steady, told her she'd be spending the night in town, somewhere safe. Jerry chimed in, saying we'd get a priest out there tomorrow to take care of the spirit. His words weren't much more than a band-aid, but it was enough. She broke down again, though this time it wasn't fear. It was relief. She hugged us both, her frail arms clutching like we were lifelines. We drove her to the motel, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzes and flickers. Checking her in, she already seemed better, like a weight had been lifted just from being away from that house. She smiled, her face softening in a way that reminded me of someone younger. She kept thanking us, saying how much she looked forward to finally sleeping through the night without that thing banging on her doors. Jerry and I waved her off with a smile, but as soon as we pulled out of the parking lot, those smiles faded. The ride back was quiet, heavy. We liked Mrs. Garrity, always had, even when she was making those strange calls that never amounted to anything. But this was different. The woman we dropped off wasn't just eccentric anymore, she was broken. When we got back to the station, we filled the chief in. He listened, then sighed, the same kind of sigh you give when you know a hard truth is settling in. We all knew she couldn't stay on her own anymore. Tomorrow we'd visit her son and daughter, make them understand. And if they didn't, the chief would handle it himself. One way or another, Mrs. Garrity wasn't going back to that house. Not alone. The call came at 4 a.m., jolting me awake like a splash of cold water. The chief's voice was urgent, and though he didn't say much, I knew it had to be about Mrs. Garrity. Dread coiled tight in my gut as I threw on clothes, a sickening sense that maybe she hadn't made it through the night. When I pulled up to the motel, that sinking feeling deepened. Crime scene tape fluttered outside her door, casting a sickly glow under the buzzing street lamp. The chief, Jerry, Pete, Vance, and some state police were already there, grim-faced. The chief caught my eye, his expression darker than I'd ever seen it. He didn't wait long before confirming my worst fear. Mrs. Garrity was gone. At first, I thought he meant dead, but the look on his face told me otherwise. Gone. Not dead, not lying lifeless in that room. She was just missing. I stared at him, waiting for more, but what I saw in his eyes chilled me to the bone. The chief was afraid. Neighbors had heard screams, terrible, blood-curdling sounds. Around 2 a.m., they had called the police when it went silent, and Pete and Vance were the first to arrive. They had broken down the door when no one answered. The room was locked, windows sealed from the inside. No forced entry, nothing out of place that explained what happened. I asked, "What did they find?" The chief hesitated. "You better see for yourself." He guided me under the crime scene tape and I stepped inside the room. Immediately, the air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. The room was in shambles, furniture overturned, blankets strewn across the floor. There was no sign of Mrs. Garrity, no sign of anyone, but the room was wrong. Something gnawed at the edges of my mind as I stood there, feeling the cold creep up my spine. The bed was empty, her things untouched, but something lingered in the air, a sense of violence, of something unspeakable having happened just out of sight. The chief didn't speak, just stood beside me, his silence more unsettling than anything he could have said. I didn't know what I was looking for, but the absence was louder than words. Mrs. Garrity was gone, and we had no idea where or how. All I knew was that the terror she had described in that house hadn't stayed behind. It had followed her. The room was a scene of utter devastation. Fresh blood smeared the walls, splattered across the ceiling, and stained the bed and floor. The bed sheets had been wrenched from the mattress, shredded as if in a frantic struggle to cling to something, or someone. There were 10 narrow trails of blood streaking across the carpet, each one leading away from the bed. The trails were thin, like the path left by someone grasping in vain, their fingers clawing desperately for any purchase as they were dragged from the bed. I followed those bloodied marks across the room, my heart pounding with each step. The trails ended abruptly at the closet door. I glanced at the chief, whose stern face betrayed a flicker of dread in his eyes. I approached the closet, the silence in the room heavy. The door was ajar, swinging slightly as if disturbed by a recent presence. I peered inside, bracing myself for what I might find. The closet was empty. The floor was clean, untouched by the chaos that had pervaded the rest of the room. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just emptiness, a stark and unsettling void. They never found Mrs. Garrity.